Jasper Johns is the other artist who's associated with the Neo-Dada movement in the 1950s. He's considered pre-pop in the same way that Robert Rauschenberg is. The work that he produced is work that is often considered mysterious and dense and difficult to understand, and that's also similar to Rauschenberg's work. And it's no surprise that these two were lovers from 1953 to 1961, uh, romantic partners, best friends. They lived in the same building uh, during this time period, and they kind of described each other as their best audience. They talked about ideas, they swapped ideas. Jasper Johns, like I said in the last PowerPoint, grew up in South Carolina. He was poor. He could not afford college. After 3 semesters, he had to drop out. So he joined the services, in his case, the Army. And after the Army, he went to New York and he just knew he wanted to be an artist. He'd known that from a young age. He didn't know how to do it. He didn't know what he was going to do, but he ended up meeting Rauschenberg and being introduced to other artists that Rauschenberg knew, because Rauschenberg was this big gregarious guy. You know, he knew everybody. He talked to people. He had a circle of friends. Jasper Johns was not. He was introverted. He worked in a bookstore when he was in New York and when they met. And Rauschenberg really encouraged him to make art, to follow his vision. We don't really have any of Jasper Johns' early work because he destroyed it all after his success in 1958, and so there's no real work that you can see his ideas germinating. So it appears like boom, he's suddenly this amazing artist, as we'll talk about. But the other thing I want to talk about with him, and also as it relates to Robert Rauschenberg, is just give a little bit of historical background about what these artists faced being gay men in the 1950s. Beginning after the war, there was a string of highly publicized murders of children around the country. They were not connected. There wasn't some serial killer on the loose, but there were instances of young children being kidnapped and being killed. And for whatever reason, the press glommed onto these as if it was this national epidemic. Although studies have shown since then that there was really no more of these incidents than there ever was. But for whatever reason, it became something that was later referred to as a sex crimes panic. And in the grip of this fear, the public and the government demonized one group of people in particular, and that was gay men. And gay men were considered degenerates, and they were thought to be particularly drawn to children who they would abduct from their homes in the middle of the night, you know, every parent's worst fear. They would sexually molest them and then they would kill them. This was mostly the fantasy of these agencies and of the press. Uh, the 98% of these crimes that happened were committed by degenerate straight men. But people didn't want to think about that. They wanted somebody to blame. And so gay men were blamed for this, and all kinds of laws were enacted across the country that made it perfectly illegal for gay men to be arrested for no cause. And in fact, men were sent to insane asylums in an attempt to cure them of their homosexuality. They were given shock treatments. This was all without being convicted of a crime. This happened in Iowa. It was particularly strong in some of the Midwestern states where people were accused, they lost their jobs, they lost their family, they lost everything they had, and they were incarcerated for, in some cases for years, actually. So it was a particularly frightening time to be gay in America. It was also something that was mainly focused on gay men. Lesbians seemed to not really be on the radar of this kind of witch hunt, if you want to call it that. I'm showing you the cover of a magazine called the American Magazine, and in this magazine from 1947, there's a whole article about this. You can see on the cover, "How safe is your daughter?" it says. And J. Edgar Hoover promoted this idea. He was the head of the FBI. "The nation's women and children will never be safe so long as degenerates run wild." And then the illustration from inside is this big hand that's coming to get these young girls as they run. And there's that quote from J. Edgar Hoover. This unfounded fear continued into the 1950s. It was this era in which the American family was celebrated as the moral center of the universe, and gay men lacking family were considered to be the opposite of that. It was a very black and white spectrum in America in this time. You were either a good American or you were not. And gay men were not good Americans. So American Magazine is still asking, 8 years later, "How safe is your youngster?" in 1955. Despite the fact that the Kinsey Report was released in 1948, and it was an empirical scientific study of sexuality among the population of the United States, there were two reports, one about male sexuality and another about female sexuality. And even though um, it it came out in 1948, and it said that approximately 40% of American males had had homosexual experiences in their lifetime, uh, and thus was a very prevalent concept in American society. People refused to believe that part and continued to consider homosexuality as something foreign, something other, and something very un-American, and something that parents needed to be particularly vigilant against, lest a gay man get your child. Here's a couple of more, an advertisement for a book on the right that was coming out, "The New Moral Menace to Our Youth," which was going to be released, and then a magazine article, one of many during the 1950s, about the proof of perversion in homosexuals. According to popular belief, it says homosexuals are a third sex, born with bodies of the wrong sex, hereditarily incapable of normal love, easily recognized by one another, impotent men and frigid women, feminine men and masculine women, highly talented and created. Goes on, but then it says none of these is true, and goes on to kind of stoke fears about the homosexuals living amongst us. And this idea that homosexuals were invisible and thus needed to be looked at very carefully. People needed to be extra cautious. They needed to be extra watchful and vigilant for homosexual appearances or behaviors or inflections in speech or the way you might walk. It was something that that kind of galvanized the citizens to be on the lookout. And in the government, there was particular concern for it because they feared that homosexuals had infiltrated the government and that they needed to be purged of these deviants. Is homosexuality a menace? In that book, it states, "For every homosexual who can easily be spotted by the average person, every invert knows at least half a dozen more whom only he can detect." Look out. Of course, because the government demonized gay men so profoundly, nobody was out. Everybody kept this a dirty, dark secret of their lives. And then the government believed that that made them susceptible to blackmail by the communists. And so that was even further reason, hypocritical thinking on their part, because they're, of course, the ones forcing men to lead these double lives. But now it was the fear that the Soviets could exploit this and make them give up government secrets. So there were a couple of government purges that actively sought out gays in their midst and fired people who were suspected of being them. On the state level, things weren't any better. New York was not a golden place to be gay in the 1950s and the 1960s. It had a number of laws that allowed people to be arrested. There were laws about clothing so that any woman who was wearing more than a certain number of clothing articles that could be considered male clothes could be arrested. So could any male wearing a certain number of female clothes or things that could be considered female or feminine could be arrested for that. You were not allowed to serve a known homosexual a drink in a bar in New York. Um, Men were not allowed to dance together or women to dance together in public. And there was also wiretapping that indiscriminately went on in the state of New York, hoping to catch people uh, revealing their homosexuality or their deviance on telephones and in the privacy of their own homes. So it was this era where you truly lived in fear if you were a gay man, especially because again, you could be arrested, you could be fired, you could have your life ruined and destroyed for this. Cops regularly um, cruised parks, they were constantly on the lookout, they busted suspected gay bars or gay gathering places, and it was a constant sense of surveillance. So this is the era that Rauschenberg and Johns lived in New York at this time. And this is why they were so closeted about their identity. And I think this is really one of the crucial contexts in which to think about both of their work, as I already talked about with Robert Rauschenberg and with his acts of concealing all of those intimate personal things in his combines, placing photographs of lovers and of aspects of his life, and then painting over them. And Jasper Johns is not going to go quite as far as Rauschenberg, but there is something that is almost even more coded and more secretive and more hidden in his works, because what Jasper Johns does is he presents us with ordinary objects like a flag of 1955. And he said that one of the things that he was interested in is this idea that people see things and automatically take it for what it is, and they don't look at it or examine it. To be seen but not looked at, not examined is part of the quote that I put to you right here. So you look at this flag, you don't think of it, you just think America. What does America mean, though? Is America the land of the free? Is it the land of free for everybody? How does it operate in the context of being a gay man in the 1950s? Certainly he has privileges as being a white person, but then also he faced all these other obstacles in his life too. Of course, when I say that about the flag and about Johns's work, I don't mean to suggest that that's what John intended us to think about the issue of Americanness and who constitutes an American, because the thing about Jasper Johns is he never tells you what his work is about at all. He's a notoriously silent artist. He's still alive. He's like 90 years old today, still making art and still not talking about what his art means in the least. Certainly, as I mentioned, nobody knew that he was gay outside of his small circle of friends, and so nobody would have considered the issue of homosexuality with his images until after that broke into the public consciousness again in the very late 80s and the early 90s. So what did people talk about with his work? Well, one of the sort of major avenues of exploration is this concept of ontology. They looked at an ontological explanation. And that is this area of philosophy that asks, what is a thing? What can be said to exist? How do we understand reality? And the brilliant thing about Jasper Johns' painting is that it's a flag in the same way that a flag is a flag. So on the left is a flag that you can order off the internet for, $19.99, and on the right is a Jasper Johns flag, which is a one-of-a-kind work of art, worth about $89 million or so, something in that vicinity. So it's a significant difference between the two, but is there a difference? I mean, the difference, there's a star difference because the one on the left has 50 stars, and when Jasper Johns painted his, there were only 48 states, so it has 48 stars. So there's more symmetry to it. But where does the flag stop and the painting begin, or vice versa? Can you look at this as just a flat image of a flag? Is it representational, or is it just abstraction? Because on the face of it, it's just stripes that are red and white and red and white, and a blue area with white stars on it, right? So that doesn't actually represent something, and yet it's what we consider a flag. A flag is a combination of symbols or of areas of color, in some nations' cases, that tell us, give us a patriotic message. But it's also abstraction at the same time. Certainly the stars on here that represent the states is not what typically stars symbolize in the history of symbolism. So there's a lot of questions to ask of this piece that Jasper Johns did. The other thing is that he did it in encaustic, and encaustic is a medium where you mix in your pigment with wax. And encaustic is a particularly fascinating medium because the less medium, the less color you put in, the more transparent it is. So you can have transparent layers of this paint, and then there are also very opaque layers of this paint, and you can build it up, and it freezes. It's like, wax. It's candle wax, basically, and it has this sculptural quality to it at the same time. Is it a sculpture or is it a painting? Well, it's a painting, but it has 3 dimensions too. A favorite artist of Jasper Johns is René Magritte, who's a Belgian surrealist. And in 1929, he painted the work on the right titled The Treachery of Images. And it says, this is not a pipe. It looks to all of us like a representation of a pipe, right? It seems to be a pipe. So what is it? Well, you could read it as a symbol. Pipes are often phallic symbols. You could read it as a patriarchal symbol of masculine control. You could read it as a veiled image of homoeroticism. You could do all that. You could also say it's a representation, a painting of a pipe, so technically it's not a pipe. Is that splitting hairs? Well, no, that's one of the ontological issues to get at the heart of. What is a pipe? If this isn't a pipe, what is a pipe? Is a pipe only the physical, actual pipe? What if that pipe doesn't look like this pipe? Is it still a pipe? Is the object the pipe, or is it the concept that's a pipe? Is it the word that's the pipe? Linguists would argue that the idea of a pipe is fluid, depending upon your context. So there's all kinds of wonderful kind of heady things to think about in terms of Jasper Johns just representing an American flag to us. Is this a flag? It's a painting of a flag. Is the painting of the flag the same as a flag? What does the flag mean? Blah, blah, blah. You go down those rabbit holes time and time again when you're presented with works by Jasper Johns. René Magritte recognized the slipperiness of language in a couple of paintings that he titled Interpretation of Dreams, because he gives us this image on the left, this image of a horse head, and he then labels it the door, and a clock is the wind, and a pitcher is the bird, and then a valise, well, that is a valise. So what is it? Or over in French, he has labeled this package is the sky, or this knife is a bird. So he's done the same thing. And you have to then figure out or question yourself, what is reality? What is language? Why do we call things what we call them? What is the truth about our linguistic identities, our reality, our linguistic reality? Is it the same as our physical reality? And what is the context of inventing language? Pretty much the only story that Jasper Johns ever told about the origin of the flag is that one night he dreamed of a flag and the next day he started painting one. So, maybe that's a suggestion that we go back to Rene Magritte's interpretation of dreams to think about what a flag is, or to think about his interpretations of a dream. But of course, Rene Magritte, when he named those paintings Interpretation of Dreams, he was basing that title on a book by Sigmund Freud, who was all about dream analysis and what symbols mean in our dreams and how they're connected to reality or they're connected to something else, psychological reality versus material reality. So we know this flag originated in a dream, but what is the dream? What does the flag symbolize in that dream? Is the flag just a flag? Jasper Johns' work also brings us back to Marcel Duchamp, to the Dada artist who in the 19 teens just relabeled objects like this wine rack, this bottle rack on the right, or this urinal on the left. He called the urinal the fountain, and he said it's a work of art. He signed it. He signed the bottle rack, said it's a work of art. These are called ready-mades, and it questioned, again, the ontological meaning of art. What is art? What is a functional object? For Duchamp, he says that art is whatever an artist calls art. He named something, he gave it a new meaning as an art object, not a functional object, and thus it is art. And so Jasper Johns picks this up again in the 1950s. And this is fundamentally different, though, because he's painting a flag. He's making a reproduction of a flag. And yet it's still a flag, right? You can't say that it's not a flag. So it's the same thing as an actual flag, because all a flag is an arrangement of symbols. So it takes us on this winding, looping story again. Jasper Johns was named by his parents after an ancestor on the father's side, maybe it's the mother's, on one of his parents' side, who fought in the Revolutionary War and who was a local hero because he was killed while he was lifting the American flag up during a battle. And the British shot him and killed him. So is this American flag linked to Jasper Johns, to Jasper Johns' family? He had a terrible upbringing. His father was an alcoholic. His mother abandoned him. He was raised by a grandmother who then died, and then he was raised by an aunt. And so not the greatest family for him. Is he relating to that? He manipulates the flag, stacking one on top of the other vertically on the left, or literally painting these 3 different paintings and then stacking them together like a wedding cake on the right. He painted flags for about 5 years until 1959, and the only explanation he ever gave for not continuing it is that Alaska and Hawaii became states and they changed the flag, and so he didn't like the new design, so he stopped painting flags because this was no longer relevant, which then gives it a historical nature if he's painting a flag with 48 stars. So he must have wanted to be current and contemporary in his flag painting, right? But what does that do for us if we know that? 2 more flags. Does it make a difference that the flag is all white or the flag is against a orange background? Is it still a flag? Is it still the flag? The other body of work that he began in 1955 is the series of targets. So this is before the Target store that we are all familiar with and love, but it's this type of symbol that's very similar to a flag, right? We immediately recognize it for what it is. It's a target. And yet it also can have multiple meanings, especially when you think about Jasper Johns as a gay man in the 1950s. He must have felt like a target. So there's a personal aspect to his own life in these target paintings. But if you don't think about that, then generally it just looks like, an archery target or something of that nature. If you think about it, Jasper Johns' targets aren't really that much different from Joseph Albers' squares, right? Concentric shapes that are painted in different colors. And yet, Joseph Albers is considered the premier formalist modern sort of idea. And yet what you have with Jasper Johns is you've got a target you've got abstraction that becomes representation because you can identify it as a target, which is just an average thing in everybody's normal life. So it's nothing that you can get all spiritual about, and you can't get hoity-toity and transcendent, whereas that is the goal for something like a Joseph Albers. And does the meaning of the target change when it becomes a monochrome painting, just like we saw the white flag earlier? Now we have the green target, where it does. I mean, it does sort of change meaning because you can no longer um, direct your attention in such a precise way towards the center, and it's a little bit more mysterious. Or gray target, which is also ambiguous. Gray would become one of Jasper Johns' favorite colors. He would use it in a number of paintings in the 60s especially, but he really starts getting into it by the end of the 50s. Also in 1955, the same year he starts the Flag series and the Target series, Jasper Johns does these works that combine painting along with a little sculpture. So again, you can see the influence of Rauschenberg here in the work of Johns. This is titled Target with Four Faces, and it's really effective. These faces are like these molds of a face, all the same face, and it's been cut off just above the nose. So you've got this face shrouded in darkness, and then there's a hinged door that actually closes and opens, so you can conceal the faces, hide them, or you can keep it open so you can see them all kind of looking at you. The other thing is I've included a detail here is on these encaustic paintings. These paintings are not just paintings on a empty surface. Instead, what Johns does is he puts newspaper underneath, and so in areas where the encaustic is more transparent, you can see some headlines and you can see some text from different newspaper articles that he's cut out and pasted onto the surface. And so that gives it another layer of hidden meaning. Did Jasper Johns choose these newspaper articles because they're meaningful to him? Do they have some kind of autobiographical interest to the guy? Some kind of symbolism for him? We can't know because in order to see them, you'd have to scrape the paint off. But in some areas you can see it, I mean. Of course, these anonymous faces also give you this wonderful sense of being watched, as if you had to be on your guard at all times. The neighbors are watching you. They might spot you. They might call you in. At the same time, another gay artist in New York, George Tooker, who was a representational painter, painted this image titled The Government Bureau of 1956. And it's this part of a series of works that he does in the 1950s about being alienated in the city and about being the subject of people watching, of government surveillance, again, to use that word, but of a sense that you're being monitored. Big Brother is watching. So you've got in his piece all these eyeballs and faces just sticking out of these circles behind the clouded glass, and it's really, I think, an interesting combination between this and the target with faces. Here's a couple more of George Tooker's works, The Subway from 1950 and The Waiting Room from 1959. So you can see for pretty much this whole decade, George Tooker was really kind of thinking about this type of surveillance. In The Subway, you can see these three guys that are in those kind of rectangular spaces, almost like they're photo booths. who are kind of staring and looking out. And it's very similar the way he's arranged his space to the space that you see in the work by Jasper Johns, or the waiting room, where people also are lined up in their little cubicles, and kind of the sense of conformity that's also a part of 1950s America. Everybody, really was pushed to be the same. Another work from 1955 by Jasper Johns is The Target with Plaster Casts. In this case, the individual compartments can be shut and opened and shut and opened. And what you see in there are all of these body parts of different aspects of the human body. That includes a nose and an ear and a foot and a part of a hand and a penis in green. So they're generally like masculine body parts that suggest, again, this kind of fragmentation of the person, and suggest kind of this lack of being a whole person. And you could also see that as being something that really afflicted gay men of this period, where you had to compartmentalize literally, and here figuratively and literally, aspects of your lives in order to be a success. In 1957, the gallery owner Leo Castelli came to the studio of Robert Rauschenberg because he was thinking about taking him on as one of his artists in his gallery. Leo Castelli had shown abstract expressionists, and he was starting to think of showing this younger generation of artists, and he wanted to see some more work by Rauschenberg. And Rauschenberg said, "Oh, you should see the work of Jasper Johns, who was in the studio below his." And so Leo Castelli went down and saw the work of Jasper Johns and immediately offered him a show. And so 10 months later, in 1958, he had this exhibition of Jasper Johns in his gallery, and it was a knockout show. It was everything in it sold except for the target with plaster casts. Probably that penis scared people, and suddenly Jasper Johns was on the cover of Art News magazine, and it was this new declaration of a new type of art, something that was intellectual and something that was thoughtful and philosophical, and something that wasn't the personal abstraction of people associated with abstract expressionists. So it became a big moment at just the beginning of his career, really. It's his first show. He'd had a couple of works in group exhibitions, but boom, right out of the gate, the Museum of Modern Art bought 4 of his paintings from this show, and it was just a phenomenon. One of my favorite critics is a guy by the name of Leo Steinberg, who wrote about these almost as dead objects. He said, "In the end, these pictures by Jasper Johns come to impress me as a dead city might, but a dead city of terrible familiarity. Only objects are left, man-made signs which in the absence of men have become objects, and Johns has anticipated their dereliction. I am alone with this thing." That's a very nice way of saying just the kind of silence of them, that they confound easy explanation. They're recognizable as symbolic things, but they're not necessarily recognizable as art things. So they operate in these 2 different worlds, and you're not quite ever sure which world they are. In 1956, Johns did this work titled Book, and I don't think that he ever really intended it to be a major work of art, and it really isn't a major work of art. I think it was something he was just doing in his studio, but I think it's kind of enigmatic and emblematic of his entire output, because what it is a book, an actual book that he's taken, and he worked in a bookstore, and he loves to read. He's a reader and an introvert and all that. And what he's done is he's painted encaustic over it so that the pages are glued together. You can't read it. It's a book that is unreadable. So again, he's taken this thing and he's made it a non-functioning thing, And it also has this appearance of a Barnett Newman painting. It's like this abstraction. It has become just an object like a painting, even though it contains knowledge and information and whatever. We don't know what book it is, but it's the written word, but it's no longer the written word. It's entombed in wax and color. And here's a Barnett Newman on the left, just to remind you of, visual similarities and things, but also the idea of a painting as being completely transcendent and not an object, but an idea, and an idea of glory and being above this place. And then this is a book. It's a book. It's a thing that somebody has produced. It's a very significant object. It has meaning, but it's also not a book. And so you've got this duality. It can't ever not be a book, just like his paintings can never not be a flag or not be a target. So there's a concreteness to them that doesn't allow you this sort of spiritual uplift, even as they're also abstractions. The other thing about these paintings by Jasper Johns that makes them feel so still and so entombed is that they're done in encaustic. And encaustic, the wax technique that I was mentioning earlier, is something that is historically associated with a tradition of mummy portraiture done in Egypt during the Roman occupation of Egypt. There were these paintings done on wooden boards that were then wrapped up with the mummy, and they were portraits. And pretty much until Jasper Johns revived encaustic, it was thought of as an ancient technique used for mummy portraiture. And so it's got this almost historical veneer of being associated with burial and being associated with entombment that still communicates when he starts using it. After doing book, he also did canvas of 1956 and drawer of 1957, again taking the function and making it completely non-functional. In the case of canvas, he actually paints this canvas with its face turned backwards and attaches it to a sheet of plywood, and then paints the plywood as well as the backward facing canvas. So we don't see the painting on the canvas. We only see the grayness of the canvas on a wall. And then in a drawer, he paints over this drawer. So we see its outline, but it's not a functional drawer. It doesn't open to reveal anything. And he began to think about obsolescence and about objects that don't work and where that places them on the spectrum of art versus object. He also, as you can see, turns to gray for this exploration, finding it to be a little bit more interesting to him, at least, than the book that was so colorful that he had painted. Between 1958 and 1961, Jasper Johns made a series of sculptures, and it's really his only sculptural activity is this period of about 3 years, where he really was fascinated with the process of it. And actually, what he was doing is he used this material called sculpt metal, which went on wet. You applied it to the surface of something, and then it hardened and became like a sculpture, basically. And so what he did is he took objects that existed, like this light bulb in a socket and a flashlight, and he then covered that with sculpt metal, and these are his sculptures. He basically painted a sculpture, and he liked, again, that wordplay, that irony of that. For the flashlight, he painted everything except for the area where the light comes out, the plastic end. But you couldn't turn it on. Obviously, it didn't function. It was functional, but it didn't function. Again, we're reminded of the sculptural legacy of Marcel Duchamp, not just the conceptual legacy, although that's there too. And after the success of Jasper Johns' 1958 show, he was able to meet Marcel Duchamp in this period when he became so interested in sculpture. And so it makes sense that meeting his idol, his hero, allowed him to, or it didn't allow, but it fostered the sense that he wanted to make kind of new ready-mades in a sense. Two more, once again, returning to the same subjects, the flashlight and a light bulb. Ironically, things that we use to illuminate the darkness to bring in much needed functionality to our lives, and now they can't do anything except just lie there. He also did a couple of kind of biting satire of art critics in these two pieces. Here at the end of this period, 1961, the critic sees on the top, he sculpted this brick with these glasses in it, and then where the critic's eyeballs would be, you see mouths and teeth. And so it's not that the critic actually can see, the critic can only talk, the critic can only criticize. And so he is really insulting critics here in this piece. Or the critic smiles down there. You've got this toothbrush, but instead of bristles, you have these teeth lined up in this really creepy kind of. Both of them are very much in the tradition of surrealist objects. Although he was making sculptures during this time, he also didn't stop painting. False Start and Jubilee, two paintings from 1959, where he developed this kind of encaustic painting of colored areas that look like they're spontaneous, but they're not, because encaustic dries right away. And so it's kind of faked spontaneity in this work. And then he takes these stencils and makes these letters and stencils in these colors of different varieties. So you see white and orange and gray in False Start, and the colors don't correspond to the patches of color that they're on. And then in the gray and white and black Jubilee, you still have those colors, and once again, they don't correspond to the colors that are there, because there are in fact no colors. He produced maps during this time where the brushstrokes kind of interfere with the individual states, although you can still see the individual states as well. And again, he uses stenciled letters to identify them. A couple more of these maps. Between 1960 and 1963, Jasper Johns made three paintings that explicitly referred to abstract expressionism and the kind of overblown macho ideas of them. The first of them of those paintings is Painting with Two Balls from 1960. And in this painting, he takes three canvases and lays them on top of each other horizontally. And he makes these brush strokes that again are kind of like action painting, but they're not action painting because they just seem still and kind of preserved there like blotches. And then between two canvases, he puts two balls, like little playing balls. The paint that's been applied to the surface of the canvases has been placed on top of newspaper articles, and the ones that are visible refer to sports and sporting events. So there's kind of that macho athletic kind of idea here. At the bottom, you've got Painting with Two Balls, 1960, J. Johns. Again, he's using stencils to kind of make this impersonal, except he does use his own handwriting for 1960, but not for his name, and he only uses the first letter, J. Johns. This is interesting because these two balls really disrupt the whole field. It's not just three canvases, a triptych that are connected to each other. The balls make it about the balls, and so does the title. And obviously these two balls refer to testicles, and they refer to this kind of machismo kind of idea of the rugged abstract expressionist painter that I talked about when I talked about the abstract expressionists themselves, and talked about this ideal of them as being very, very vigorous men who are athletes and who are like cowboys and things like that. And Jasper Johns and Rauschenberg, being two gay men who aren't these epitome of the rough and ready, rugged cowboy, thought that that was a lot of hooey. And so he uses these two balls to refer to the testicles of the abstract expressionists, the idea that Jackson Pollock was Jackson the Dripper, that he, as he was called, that he was really like painting with his penis, that was this act of virility. These are all ideas that were around in the air about abstract expressionism, Jackson Pollock in particular. So what this is, painting with two balls, it's just making fun of that whole idea of holding it up to ridicule and making it into a joke. These are like joke paintings in many ways. Fool's House from 1961 also plays off this idea, and there's more things added to this, and you can really get a sense that he has been inspired by Rauschenberg and his combines. Here you've got a big broom, and then you've got a towel, and you've got a stretcher with a canvas turned to its to face the bigger canvas, and then you've got a cup, and you see that Jasper Johns has labeled all of those things. The big broom is like a big paintbrush. It's making this big brush stroke. It's also been labeled broom. Up in the top, you can see using stencils. He's stenciled in the name and the date, Fool's House, 1961, and he's making fun of this idea of this big bravado, the brushstroke of abstract expressionism, this idea that it is transcendent, and he's saying it's not transcendent. This is a broom, this is a towel, this is a stretcher. He's using everyday objects in the way that Rauschenberg used everyday objects to evoke the everyday rather than the transcendent, rather than the universal, rather than these big grand ideas. He brings it back down to earth with his very common everyday things that a painter has in a painter's studio. So then he labels it a fool's house. It's a fool's house if you believe these ideas about transcendental painting. In field painting from 1963, he takes aim at color field painting, and in particular Barnett Newman, because there's this big vertical line down the middle, so it's like one of his zips. And you've got these letters that are three-dimensional letters that are hinged, and they flop back and forth, and he has painted them and used them as stencils to put the colors and letters on the surface of the painting. One side of the painting is real, lots of brush strokes, kind of like a brush stroke, and then the other side is like a color field painting. So along with Factum 1 and Factum 2 that Rauschenberg was working on, field painting and Fool's House and painting with two balls kind of fall into that same category of speaking a very specific message to the art world. And it's a message of ridicule. 1961 is also the year that Rauschenberg and Johns broke up as a couple, and both went their separate ways. And it's one in which Johns did a couple of works that seem to relate to this breakup, that they're particularly personal. One is No from 1961, and the other is possibly my favorite work he ever did, titled Painting Bitten by a Man from 1961 as well. The work on the left is all gray. You can see that he often leaves the bottom undone, and so the paint or the encaustic drips down, and you can see like a ledge. That's kind of typical of Jasper Johns. But then, like Colorfield, he's got these letters that are three-dimensional letters, and they hang on a wire from the canvas, and the two letters are no, or N and O, spelling no, and they kind of dangle there in front, and their shadows cast the NO, or sometimes they cast on, I suppose. And it's just this kind of this no. It's just no, 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 a no against the void. But if you really want something against the void, the painting Bitten by a Man, it's got this layers of built up encaustic wax, again, all in gray, this neutral color. And he's just taken a bite out of it. He's just scraped his teeth. It's something that feels like Francis Bacon painted it, like this mouth screaming against the void, this existential kind of violent, terrible roar against humanity. It's just like, bite that painting. He continued to work though. Alphabet, again, using stenciled letters. He does a number of different alphabet paintings in different colors, different ways of experimenting. Monochrome white here. The work on the right is the full painting, and then just a detail of the letters on the left. You can see that the letters are all there. Or numbers from 1963, again, just letters, numbers applied in a grid, kind of messy in a way, also very neutral, done with a stencil. Numbers are things he actually did as early as 1955, so he has stuck with this motif longer than he did with the American flag. One last painting by Jasper Johns is According to What from 1964. And it's a large piece, and it's really, again, very similar to the Combines of Robert Rauschenberg. And in some ways, it's kind of a tribute to him, maybe a goodbye to their years together. You've got this figure in a chair upside down, like the taxidermy figures that appear in Rauschenberg's work, as well as furniture. Chairs appeared in his work, and so that seems to be a gesture towards him. You've got this canvas that's pointed towards the larger canvas, with the title of this piece on the lower left as well, According to What, J. Johns, 1964. You've got a recap of a field painting right there, and then just other gestural pieces that kind of refer to the entire decade that came before this. Johns, like I said, would continue to paint. He's still painting, lives in Connecticut, and has had a long and very successful career, and continues to not really talk about his work that much at all. There's going to be, I think, a couple of big Johns shows in major museums this year, or there were scheduled to be, if museums ever open up again fully. So Jasper Johns still on people's radar. People still are thinking and talking about his work quite a bit. But for now, we'll leave him in the 1960s. Cy Twombly is the third of kind of the great masters of mid-century American painting who worked in a style that was going against abstract expressionism, as we've already talked about with both Rauschenberg and with Johns. Cy Twombly, though, actually begins inspired by abstract expressionism. So his works from 1951 and 1952 look like this. They tend to be black and white, and you can maybe guess that two artists that inspired him were Willem de Kooning, who was working in black and white as well for a while, and Franz Kline. And Twombly's works were abstract almost entirely from the very beginning. And he was interested in making marks and this kind of gestural writing like lines that he made. He was also from the South, like I mentioned before, from Lexington, Virginia. And he went to Black Mountain College for 2 years in the years after Robert Rauschenberg was there. And again, these are two works he was doing when he was in New York in the early 50s. In 1952, at the end of the year, he goes on a trip to Italy and North Africa and is accompanied by Robert Rauschenberg. And it's there that he, sees his first, comes into contact with his first experience with old master paintings, and also with contemporary art. And his art changes somewhat as a result of this. These are a couple works from the following year, and he continues to work in black and white, but now his works are a little bit more um, uh, draftsman-like. It's like drawings. His line becomes thinner. You have representational suggestions rather than just smears of paint. And so it's almost like the marks that you find, again, on walls, scratches on things, bits of graffiti that you might find in an urban center. So there's a lot about art informal that seems to inform him, particularly the works of Antonio Tapias, whose works tended to go more for the graffiti-like images. Here are two very similar works from that year as well. By the end of the year, Cy Twombly joined the army, and he didn't see any military action. In fact, the Korean War had just ended. And instead, because he had been to school, he was given an assignment to be a cryptographer in Washington, D.C. So he worked cracking codes and learning the essentials about that line of work, different languages, different symbologies that are used in creating codes that the enemy can't crack. And it was an experience that he would talk about for the rest of his life, and it was very influential for him. One way that this was immediately apparent in his work is he began to create paintings that were like scribbles that seemed like language, but they weren't. We've already seen how this was something that some artists had already been doing in the 1940s that later on became abstract expressionists like Lee Krasner or Bradley Walker Tomlin. But this is a very different type of language. These are marks that are almost childlike, that have no meaning, except for every now and then you can see a letter or two in his early pieces. There is something very childlike in the just the scribbling intensity that he achieves in works like Geeks. Critics didn't know what to do with these works. They generally didn't like them, didn't consider them very worthy things, didn't consider them paintings in some cases. I should mention that they don't translate very well into photographic imagery. So here on these PowerPoints, I know they don't look very great. In real life, they have this weird energy power that, at least for me, makes them mesmerizing. Even as they're sloppy and they don't look like anything at the same time. So they're really intriguing because of that dichotomy, that they're both sloppy and yet they're also intense. In Olympia from 1957, you can see not only the words scrawled in there, Olympia, but you can see other words as well, and you see things like hearts and little drawings. So the doodling aspect becomes even more pronounced as he goes along. In 1957, Cy Twombly moved to Italy permanently. He would spend large chunks of time, several months out of the year, in the United States, coming back to visit family and spend time there and to spend time in New York. But he made his permanent residence in Italy after 1957, and he continued to paint for another 50 years, creating works that, for a while, didn't stray that far from works like this. By the 1950s, or excuse me, the 1960s, he had incorporated along with doodles, and still there's written things that he writes in pencil on the canvas, but he also puts these splashes of color, and I mean literally splashes. And for a period of time, this color was not sumptuous, beautiful color. It was kind of ugly color. It's ugly, like it's almost like baby food. If you've ever been around a baby that throws their food or that just gets very enthusiastic about eating, um, and this kind of has some of the appearance of baby food. So it's ugly, but it's also weird and kind of lyrical, but also not. Then it kind of fits in with the whole art brut, Jean de Buffet kind of thing that was going on in France, but it's also uh, definitely Cy Twombly's own thing. Even though he considered himself to be a gay man, he struck up a relationship with a very wealthy Italian woman who was aware that he was homosexual, or he professed to be. And they got married and they had a kid and they had an open relationship. So he also had a male partner that he was in a long term relationship with throughout his life, as well as living with his wife in both their Rome apartment, and they also had a country estate. And he made work like this. Uh, so he was wealthy and didn't need to worry about selling these things for a while because he wasn't selling them. But then later he became known as one of the great painters of the 20th century. Lighter scribbling on a darker ground seems to be a little bit more presentational. It's a little bit more accepted as art. There's a little bit more sense of these as paintings than the other works where they seem very scratchy and much more scribble or doodle-like. Like Jasper Johns, he was a voracious reader, and he was particularly fascinated with Greek mythology, Roman mythology, and he does a number of works that he links them in series where he deals with different aspects of either classical mythology or classical history, the history of particular Roman emperors, for example, he would make paintings about. And again, they were like paintings like this, where there's some kind of floral aspects, for example, on the work on the right, but then also words written. Or here, this work, Apollo, there's like lists. It's literally a list, but large on a big canvas. Here's two more in that vein. And two more of the kind of smear, drip, bacchanalia on the left. It's almost like a child has been playing with its poop or something, and it just smears it on the walls. If you've ever experienced that, or if you're a parent or a babysitter, they do things like that. I swear to God. And it's got this like almost regressive aspect of kind of going back into your pre-literate brain where you are, you know, working out and trying to figure out your existence in a life of symbol systems. So there's that aspect to the work too, which draws people to it, this kind of Freudian reading of it. And although I know that a lot of these look like they're done on a piece of paper, like these are literally just drawings and scribbles that he's making, they're quite large. So here's an installation view in a gallery, and that's Cy Twombly as an old guy standing there looking at this retrospective of his work. And you get a sense of how huge they are. And just the pure ferocity and beauty of the mark making. A number of these are done in oil stick so that it is very graphic, even as it's also paint. His later work, he gets a lot more colorful as well, and he also becomes very fascinated with flowers. Flowers have been beautiful forever. How can they be something that makes an artist suddenly curious? But they are, and so he paints these large room size images of flowers that are dripping and that are like almost like clouds in the sky that are raining. Just another image on the left to give you a sense of scale, and also another of his colorful late pieces. All right, well, that's Cy Twombly and Jasper Johns, and again, along with Robert Rauschenberg, these neo-Dada artists who make you question what art is, and can art be scribbles, and can art be a flag, and can art be things that you pick up off the streets for free. So yeah, that's it. Have a good night.